Welcome to our channel. Today, we're diving into the top 10 militaries that failed to crush guerrilla wars. Let's get started. Our journey begins in Vietnam, where the US military struggled against the Viet Cong. Picture this: American soldiers, napalm raining, B-52 bombers in action. Yet the enemy remained elusive, melting back into the jungle. The Vietnamese terrain negated much of the American technological advantage. The Viet Cong used the jungle to their advantage, setting traps and launching surprise attacks. The Vietnam War reminds us that military might alone is not enough to guarantee victory. Our journey begins in the sweltering jungles of Vietnam, where the United States military, despite its firepower and technological superiority, struggled against the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. Picture this: American soldiers, armed with advanced weaponry, napalm raining from the sky, B-52 bombers turning villages to dust. Yet the enemy remained elusive, melting back into the jungle, only to re-emerge to strike again. The Vietnamese terrain, a labyrinth of dense jungle and treacherous mountains, negated much of the technological advantage the Americans enjoyed. The Viet Cong, masters of camouflage, used the jungle to their advantage, setting booby traps, launching surprise attacks, and disappearing before American air power could be brought to bear. The Vietnam War serves as a stark reminder that military might alone is not enough to guarantee victory. From the jungles of Southeast Asia, we shift to the towering Hindu Kush Mountains of Afghanistan, a land known as the graveyard of empires. In 1979, the Soviet Red Army rolled into Afghanistan, expecting a swift victory against a disorganized enemy. The Afghan Mujahideen, fueled by a fierce Islamic faith and a deep-seated hatred of foreign invaders, proved to be a formidable foe. They used the rugged terrain to their advantage, launching hit-and-run attacks against Soviet convoys and outposts. The Soviets found themselves fighting a phantom enemy, one that could disappear into the mountains as quickly as it emerged. Adding fuel to the fire, the United States funneled weapons and supplies to the Afghan resistance, turning the conflict into a proxy war. In 1989, after almost a decade of war, the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, its military prestige tarnished. Our exploration of guerrilla warfare now takes us to Algeria, where France found itself locked in a brutal struggle to hold on to its North African colony. The Algerian War from 1954 to 1962 was marked by atrocities on both sides. The French army, confident in their ability to crush the rebellion, won major battles and inflicted heavy casualties on the FLN. However, the FLN adopted a strategy of attrition, using hit-and-run attacks, sabotage, and terrorism to wear down the French will to fight. The French army, frustrated by their inability to crush the rebellion, resorted to increasingly harsh measures, which proved counterproductive. These brutal tactics alienated the Algerian population and turned international opinion against France. Finally, in 1962, after 8 years of brutal fighting, France granted Algeria its independence. The French had won nearly every major engagement, yet they lost the war. The specter of Vietnam returned to haunt the United States in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, as the US military found itself drawn into a protracted guerrilla war in Afghanistan. The US invasion of Afghanistan, launched in response to the Taliban's refusal to hand over Osama bin Laden, was initially successful. However, the conflict soon morphed into a complex and frustrating counterinsurgency campaign. The Taliban, written off by many as a spent force, proved to be far more resilient than anticipated. They used the rugged countryside to their advantage, much like the Mujahideen had done against the Soviets. Finally, in 2021, after nearly 2 decades of fighting, the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, leaving the country in the hands of the Taliban. The echoes of Vietnam, of a superpower humbled by a determined guerrilla force, were impossible to ignore. Before there was an American Vietnam, there was a French Indochina. The First Indochina War, from 1946 to 1954, pitted the French army against the Viet Minh. The turning point came in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The Viet Minh surrounded the French base and hauled heavy artillery over mountains. After a brutal 57-day siege, the French garrison was overrun. The defeat marked the end of French colonial rule in Indochina. As the United States military withdrew from Vietnam in 1973, the fate of South Vietnam hung precariously in the balance. The South Vietnamese Army, or ARVN, now stood alone, facing a determined and well-equipped North Vietnamese army. Despite billions of dollars in U.S. military aid, the South Vietnamese seemed unable to match the North Vietnamese's commitment to reunification. The North Vietnamese launched a massive offensive in the spring of 1975, sweeping aside ARVN resistance with astonishing speed. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, effectively ending the Vietnam War. The collapse of South Vietnam was a humiliating defeat for the United States. From the jungles of Southeast Asia, we journey to the emerald green hills of Ireland, where the Irish people fought a bitter guerrilla war against British rule. The Irish War of Independence, from 1919 to 1921, pitted the might of the British Empire against the Irish Republican Army, or IRA. The IRA, though vastly outnumbered and outgunned, used ambushes, assassinations, and sabotage to wear down the British will to fight. The British found themselves fighting an elusive enemy, one that could disappear into the civilian population. The conflict soon descended into a brutal cycle of violence and reprisal, with atrocities committed by both sides. In 1921, after 2 years of bitter fighting, the British government agreed to a truce with the IRA, leading to the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. The treaty granted Ireland dominion status within the British Empire, effectively ending the war. Our exploration of guerrilla warfare now takes us to Africa, where Portugal found itself embroiled in a series of protracted guerrilla wars that would spell the end of its empire. The Portuguese Colonial War, from 1961 to 1974, was a series of conflicts fought in Portugal's African colonies of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. The Portuguese army, though equipped with modern weaponry, faced determined guerrilla movements fighting for independence. The guerrillas, inspired by nationalism and anti-colonialism, used the terrain to their advantage and exploited the Portuguese army's weaknesses. The Portuguese government, led by the Estado Novo regime, resorted to increasingly brutal tactics, which only strengthened the resolve of the guerrillas. In 1974, the Estado Novo regime was overthrown in a military coup, paving the way for Portugal's withdrawal from its African colonies. The Portuguese Colonial War marked the end of Portugal's empire. Our next stop takes us to southern Africa, where the South African Defence Force, or SADF, found itself embroiled in a protracted guerrilla war against the Southwest Africa People's Organization, or SWAPO. The South African Border War, from 1966 to 1989, was fought in Southwest Africa, a territory administered by South Africa. SWAPO, a Marxist-Leninist organization, was fighting for the independence of Southwest Africa. The SADF, though vastly superior in firepower, found itself fighting an elusive enemy that used the rugged terrain to its advantage. SWAPO guerrillas, based in neighboring Angola, launched cross-border raids into Southwest Africa, attacking SADF bases and strategic targets. In 1988, after more than 2 decades of fighting, the South African government agreed to a ceasefire with SWAPO and granted independence to Southwest Africa, renamed Namibia. The South African Border War was a costly drain on South Africa's resources and became increasingly unpopular with the public. Our final chapter takes us to the volatile border region between Israel and Lebanon, where the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, found itself drawn into a protracted guerrilla war with Hezbollah. The First Lebanon War, which began in 1982 with an Israeli invasion of Lebanon, morphed into an 18-year occupation of a security zone in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah, a Shia Islamist militant group backed by Iran, waged a relentless campaign of attrition against the IDF. Roadside bombs, ambushes, and mortar attacks became a daily occurrence, slowly bleeding the IDF and eroding Israeli public support for the occupation. The IDF, despite its technological superiority, found it difficult to strike decisive blows without causing significant civilian casualties. In 2000, under intense public pressure, Israel unilaterally withdrew from southern Lebanon, ending its 18-year occupation. The conflict highlighted the challenges of fighting a guerrilla war against a determined and well-organized enemy. As we've seen in these 10 cases, military superiority alone is not enough to win a guerrilla war. The very technology and firepower that make a conventional military formidable can be rendered ineffective against an enemy adept at blending into the population and using the terrain to its advantage. The true strength of a guerrilla force lies in its ability to endure. These are wars of liberation, fueled by ideology, nationalism, and a deep-seated resentment of foreign intervention. Victory in a guerrilla war is often as much about politics and public opinion as it is about military might. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful content.